Well, to discuss China's changing property market in more depth, we're joined from New York by Craig Nassi, CEO of BCN Development. Welcome to the show.
Good evening. How are you?
Good, thank you. Now, as we saw for the first time in a long time, property investment dipped for the first time in May. How much of that is due to the government's cooling measures?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with it. The government, if we compare the U.S. government and the Chinese government and how they affect free capital markets and real estate, I think it's night and day. I think the Chinese government tests different procedures and policies and sees how it affects the open market, and then they tweak it around as they can as time goes on. I think that's what we're seeing right now. I see they're testing the markets and seeing what effects they're having. And they also know they do have a huge supply issue as well in many cities throughout China, which also is always going to affect prices.
Now, they have been trying a number of different kinds of restrictions and measures. What do you think have been the most effective?
Well, it seems like the higher down payments on second homes is extraordinarily effective because it's such a huge burden. I think it's up to 70% of purchase price. So when you're talking about $1 million property, someone has to have $700,000 liquid to put down on a property. That's an enormous amount. We don't even see that in our market here in the United States, specifically in New York. Most of our buyers are putting 30% down and taking 70% mortgages. And our government doesn't restrict, obviously cannot restrict, how people choose to finance their properties. I do think the larger down payments are always going to slow things down in China.
Now, Craig, how do the trends that we're seeing in Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities compare to, say, the lower cities in China?
Well, it seems the biggest, most glamorous cities in China are the safest, and I think the old theory of perception is everything in real estate is holding true. When the perception is, you take New York, for example, being the safest place to invest in commercial real estate in the United States, that perception has carried through loud and clear to everyone around the world, and it just happens consistently. The Chinese have purchased trophy, glamorous, amazing properties here in the city, and it's forced other people from other nations to come here and invest as well. I think last year, the year before last, the highest profiled one was the Waldorf Astoria at over $2.1 billion
Right.
Chinese. So I see that happening in China. I see people flocking to Beijing, Shanghai, and sticking with the safe bet. And some of the smaller cities that are definitely flooded with inventory are having a hard time with perception right now.
Now, we are still seeing some robust growth, though, in the lower tier cities. How likely do you think it is that we'll see some of the restrictions that we saw in the Tier 1 and Tier 2 cities then transfer into the lower tier cities?
I think, just like you say, it's going to definitely carry forward into those other tiers, and it's just going to be a matter of time. And I think the government has a very close watch on what's happening and how things are proceeding. And I think the Chinese government's very smart, and they know exactly what they're doing. And look, it's controlling inflation, it's controlling supply, and it's helping the average Chinese citizen to spend wisely and not overspend and bite off too big of a piece of cake, per se, and choke on it. And that's what brought our country to a recession in 2008. We had a tremendous amount of wonderful mortgage programs out there that were letting people buy properties with 0 down or 5% down, and
Right.
people bought off more than they could chew.
Now, let's also look at where China's housing market goes from here. Some economists have suggested perhaps property taxes as a way to really keep the market cool, even if the local governments end up removing some of these restrictions. What's your take on where the market goes from here down the road?
In China?
Yes, in China.
Again, I think it's all going to be dictated by how the government watches quarterly how prices and supply absorption measure up. And I think they have a very tight rein on it. I think they're very smart in watching and monitoring, and they're not going to let it get away. It's going to be in a controlled method, and I don't think it'll evolve into an issue. I think it will be a controlled, sort of like letting water out of a dam. You know, it's got to be a controlled type of system,
Right.
And
all right. Well,
I think that's what we're seeing.
Well, thank you so much for your insights. We'll have to leave it there. Craig Nassi, CEO of BCN Development.